They've been called controlled collisions. Approaching at speeds of more than 140 miles per hour and sink rates of over 20 feet per second, naval combat aircraft must repeatedly slam on the carrier decks and be hauled within seconds to an abrupt stop. They have to be rugged to withstand this type of punishment. The structural strength translates into added weight, which cuts down on performance, range, and load-carrying capability. How rugged is rugged enough? But what about carrier launches? A catapult, mechanical slingshot, can hurl an airplane from 0 to 140 miles per hour within 2.5 seconds. How do you ensure smooth, fully controllable flight as the airplane quickly transitions from wheels and flaps down to a clean configuration, and the aerodynamic forces change in volume and intensity at an incredible rate? Though unique to naval operations, these are only a couple of the myriad of questions that aircraft designers must consider as they attempt to hone their craft into something better, more effective than anything which has preceded it. An incredibly complex array of factors come into play as they attempt to overcome problems impacting airspeed, maneuverability, range, weapons delivery, systems integration, maintainability, and, the bottom line, cost and schedule. All of these and a host of other questions must be answered to the designer's satisfaction before he can answer that most important question of all. Will his design meet the requirements? Will it get the job done? This man answered those questions about as well as anyone in his profession ever has. One of the most prolific and innovative designers of all time, Ed Heinemann, was regarded as the master of fundamental simplicity in aircraft design, and the family of airplanes he built established him as one of the true giants in the world of aviation. Not bad for a man who quit high school in 1925 to pursue a career as a draftsman. Within a year, he found himself working at the Douglas Aircraft Company in Los Angeles. Donald W. Douglas founded his aircraft company in Santa Monica in 1920. In 1932, he acquired the Moreland factory, expanding his operations. Around this time, Douglas negotiated a partnership with John K. Northrop, who would later become a legendary figure in aviation. Northrop began producing aircraft designs at the former Moreland factory, now renamed the Northrop Division of the Douglas Aircraft Company. The plant started with just 15 employees, including the young designer Edward H. Heinemann. Heinemann had previously worked as a draftsman for Moreland Aircraft and Lockheed Aircraft Company. Under Northrop's mentorship, he honed his skills in aircraft design, paving the way for his own distinguished career in aviation. During this period, Northrop designed the Alpha, a single-engined passenger and mail-carrying aircraft of all-metal construction, with open cockpit behind an enclosed cabin, and the Beta, a small two-seat all-metal sports aircraft. However, in September 1931, the United Aircraft and Transport Corporation decided to consolidate its two subsidiaries, the Northrop Aircraft Corporation and Stearman Aircraft, into a single corporate entity and to center all the operations of the enlarged company in Wichita, Kansas. The initial objective of the new company was to design and build two series of aircraft, which, continuing the tradition of naming its aircraft after Greek letters, became the Gammas and the Deltas. Whereas the Deltas were conceived initially as passenger-carrying aircraft, the Gammas were designed as special-purpose and mail-carrying aircraft. The Gamma design also played a significant yet less glamorous role as 49 aircraft were completed by Northrop, and the type was developed into the A-17 series of attack aircraft for the Army Air Corps. Although it did not achieve success, the next type of airplane designed by the Douglas subsidiary, the XF-T-1 experimental naval fighter, marked the beginning of the association between the Northrop Corporation and the U.S. Armed Forces, particularly the U.S. Navy, and for the first time gave Ed Heinemann the job of project engineer and responsibility for detailed design. At 235 miles per hour, the XF-T-1 easily proved to be the fastest aircraft in the competition, but marginal handling qualities cost Northrop the contract. The XF-T-1 served as the basis for the Model 3A proposed Army fighter. Ed Heinemann actually completed the detailed design and construction of this airplane all within 30 days. Featuring retractable landing gear, the 3A also boasted exceptional performance and impressive 279 miles per hour, but it too suffered from marginal stability. Upon receiving the Navy's invitation to bid on June 1, 1934, the Northrop Corporation selected Ed Heinemann to serve as project engineer for the program. Under the general supervision of Jack Northrop, Heinemann prepared the initial general arrangement drawings and design layouts together with the details of the proposal for the Navy's evaluation, in competition with the proposals submitted by the other 5 contractors. The Northrop proposal was favorably received by the Bureau of Aeronautics, and even though 2 of its competitors had substantially better calculated performance, one prototype of the Northrop XBT-1 was ordered on December 12, 1934. The initial design work began in 1935. The aircraft was powered by a 700-horsepower Pratt & Whitney XR1535-66, a double-row air-cooled radial engine. It featured hydraulically actuated perforated split flaps, which also functioned as dive brakes, and a main landing gear that retracted backward into streamlined fairings beneath the wings. On 28 November 1936, a change to Contract 50517 was approved by the U.S. Navy. Under its terms, Northrop was authorized to proceed with the modification of a BT-1 to incorporate a fully retractable main undercarriage folding laterally into flush-wing wells. So modified, the aircraft was redesignated XBT-2. Completed and test flown on 22 April 1938, the XBT-2 was initially powered by the same 825-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1535-94 as the production BT-1s. However, following an unfortunate wheels-up landing accident, Douglas decided, under authority of a new contract change dated June 21, 1938, to install the 1,000-horsepower Wright R1820-G133 with a 3-blade constant-speed propeller. To maintain aileron control after a stall, fixed leading-edge slots were also investigated and adopted. The results of these numerous modifications were rewarding, and the XBT-2 was now representative of the production model which had been ordered on the 8th of April, 1939. The 36 aircraft covered by the initial contract, number 65969, were designated SBD-1, reflecting both the change in mission to scout bombing and the change in manufacturer's name, since in late 1937, the Northrop Corporation had given place to the El Segundo plant of the Douglas Aircraft Company. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was a carrier-based dive bomber that played a crucial role in the Pacific theater of World War II. Developed in the late 1930s, it featured rugged construction, excellent handling, and a distinctive perforated dive brake system that allowed for precise, steep-angle bombing. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was involved in the World War II Pacific theater from day one. In service for roughly 6 months prior to Pearl Harbor, the Dauntless was the Navy's primary dive bomber in the early years of the war and has been credited with sinking one of the first enemy ships of World War II. The mighty Japanese fleet had expanded its conquests over the entire Western Pacific. Numerically far superior to the now mangled American fleet, it appeared to be almost invincible. The Japanese High Command planned for a decisive battle in the late spring of 1942, which would force the U.S. to sue for peace. Their plan? To attack the island of Midway and thereby draw the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement, which would result in its destruction. In early June, a massive armada, including 4 Japanese carriers, steamed toward Midway. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, however, the Navy had deciphered their codes, and though vastly outnumbered in terms of firepower, had 3 carriers lying in wait, hoping to spring a trap. SBDs used a dive angle of about 70 degrees, virtually straight down, which provided 2 great advantages. First, with an angle that steep, it was difficult for Japanese gunners to score hits. Guns on the carriers had to be elevated to high angles, making tracking and leading much more difficult. Barrage fire forced an aircraft to fly through the anti-aircraft fire, but because of the high dive angle, they quickly traversed the area. Second, high dive angles significantly enhanced bombing accuracy. Shallow glide bombing often resulted in short hits and made the attacking aircraft more vulnerable. Hurling yourself at the ground, as dive bomber pilots often describe the act, required a lot of training. This steep diving technique allowed pilots to maintain visual contact with their targets longer, making precise adjustments before releasing their bombs. Ed Heinemann was later to observe that the Dauntless turned out to be the right plane at the right place for the right war. On a violent June day, it certainly was. The rugged SBDs and their courageous crews were responsible for sinking all 4 Japanese carriers in a battle which had indeed become the turning point of the Pacific War. The destruction of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later the Hiryu shattered Japan's striking power and forced the Imperial Navy onto the defensive for the rest of the conflict. Even if Ed Heinemann and the Dauntless had never achieved anything else, they would have established their importance in history just on the basis of this single battle. But the SBD, which is generally regarded as the finest dive bomber ever built, went on to be one of only 2 naval combat aircraft that saw action throughout the entire war. While even before the SBD had triumphed at Midway, there were other Heinemann-conceived airplanes already in action. Back in 1936, he conceived the Model 7A as a high-performance, land-based light bomber capable of speeds in excess of 250 miles per hour. As this design was under development, however, the Army Air Corps changed its tactical requirements, asking for greater range and doubling the bomb load to 1,200 pounds. Thus, the 7A was transformed into the Model 7B prototype by late 1938. By that time, the storm clouds of war were gathering over Europe, and the French ordered 100, and then 170 more went into service as the DB-7 in 1939. These aircraft entered combat against the Germans in May of 1940, and after the fall of France, were transferred to the Royal Air Force, which flew them in great numbers throughout the rest of the war. They came into service with the U.S. Army Air Forces as the A-20 Havoc in late 1940. Capable of speeds well in excess of 300 miles per hour and serving principally as low-level attack bombers and potent gun platforms, Havocs were employed by 9 different air forces in every theater of operations throughout the war. To the crews of all nationalities who flew them into combat, the Havoc's exceptional handling qualities and inherent ruggedness in the hostile low-level environment were a godsend. Among them, it earned admiring respect because of its ability to put its weapons on target, take an incredible amount of punishment, and still bring its crews home. It was this ability to get the job done, a characteristic of all Ed Heinemann airplanes, that led to a production run of nearly 7,400 airplanes, more than any other aircraft produced by Douglas during World War II. Much of the success of this and succeeding programs was due in no small part to Heinemann's ability to put a development team together and use it effectively. He believed in delegating authority and responsibility. Like all great designers, he could be stubborn, even rigid, when it came to demanding very thorough and exacting engineering standards, and he always had the final say on any important issue. But the basis for his approach to any problem was to build consensus among all involved so they'd work together effectively toward a common goal. He often remarked that perhaps the most important key to his success was his ability to select and hire good people, and then make the best use of each of their individual talents. Shortly after becoming chief engineer, he brought Leo Devlin on board to help with the Havoc program. Devlin would remain as his second in command for the next 2 decades. Hank Holden and Al Leonhardt would come on board shortly thereafter, and all of them would stay. By the early 50s, in fact, the group came to be known as the Four Horsemen of El Segundo. Even as the earliest model A-20s were coming off the production line, the Army Air Forces expressed interest in a light bomber featuring heavier armament, more strength, more speed, and better performance. While many within the company argued that the A-20 could be upgraded, Heinemann held out for an entirely new airplane, and within 2 weeks delivered a concept for a heavier, though only slightly larger airplane with increased speed, range, and performance, and able to carry more than double the payload. To improve stability and control for combat air crews flying on the deck, he incorporated a new laminar flow wing into the design of an aircraft that would become famous as the A-26 Invader. A-26s didn't enter combat in numbers until late 1944, but performing both low-level attack and medium-altitude precision bombing missions, they quickly earned a reputation as the Air Force's most effective twin-engine bombers. Indeed, the Air Force was so impressed that the Invader was chosen as the standard light bomber for the post-war force. A decision which proved wise when in June of 1950, the North Koreans spilled over the 38th parallel. In Korea, more than a decade after it was first conceived, the recently redesignated B-26 flew both the first and last combat missions of the war, and in between, it proved to be an awesomely effective platform as it performed interdiction missions against enemy troop and supply movements, both during the day and at night. Remarkably, in an age when jets were taking over the skies, some 400 of these vintage prop airplanes flew more than 70,000 combat missions. To ruggedness and effectiveness, Ed Heinemann would be able to add the word durable, the list of adjectives describing his designs. But the Invader wasn't done yet. A small number were modified to perform counterinsurgency missions in the Vietnam conflict of the 60s, and thus this remarkable craft could lay claim to being the only American airplane ever to see combat service in 3 different wars. As the Invaders were still rolling off the production line back in 1944, Heinemann was facing a dilemma, the strong possibility that Douglas El Segundo would soon be without a major production contract. He'd designed a follow-on to the Dauntless, the gull-wing 2-seat XSB-2D, but built according to specs laid down before the war and loaded down with systems required by the Navy, he was already obsolete by the time it first flew in early 1943. At the Navy's request, he'd modified the design into the BTD-1, a single-seat torpedo bomber which first flew in March of 1944. He was well aware, however, that this airplane would be outclassed by competing aircraft designed from the outset as single-seaters. And thus, at a meeting with Navy officials in Washington in June 1944, he made a bold proposal to cancel the BTD and allow him to use the remaining funds to design an entirely new airplane. All he'd need to complete the initial concept design would be about 30 days. The Navy was intrigued, but gave him less than 20 hours to come up with concept drawings and weight and performance estimates. That night, Heinemann, Leo Devlin, and aerodynamicist Gene Root worked feverishly in a hotel room to complete the task. And by 3 a.m., Heinemann had sketched out the concept drawings for an airplane that epitomized his commitment to the precepts of simplicity and practicality. He got the go-ahead, but had only 9 months, 6 months less than his competitors, to put an airplane on the ramp. He'd promised that the BT-2D would offer significantly improved range and vastly improved load-carrying capability while coming in at a gross weight of no more than 16,500 pounds. Weight is the arch nemesis of any designer, and to achieve his goal, he established a target figure that was underweight by 750 pounds and some very rigid design policies, such as a rule that no component could be overweight unless an equivalent amount was saved elsewhere. And to get to first flight on time, a rule that no design or fabrication decision would be allowed to remain unresolved overnight. A trip to the combat areas of the Pacific, where he interviewed air crews and maintenance personnel, reconfirmed his commitment to simplicity of design in order to eliminate weight and unnecessary complexity, as well as to reduce maintenance time by 50%. With this in mind, he convinced the Navy to let him eliminate an internal bomb bay, saving 200 pounds and permitting the airplane to carry a greater variety of external stores. The SBD had been configured with 6 fuel tanks. He saved another 270 pounds by consolidating this complex system into a single tank. And by the time the prototype XBT-2D made its first flight in March of 1945, he'd sliced a full 1,000 pounds off the guaranteed gross weight, thereby automatically increasing its load-carrying capability by an almost equivalent amount. Capable of carrying a bomb load nearly 5 times that of the SBD and delivering it with far greater precision. The XBT-2D, originally called the Dauntless II, proved itself to be everything the Navy had asked for in a dive bomber torpedo attack airplane. But the recently redesigned AD-6 Skyraider series of aircraft proved to be much more in the hostile skies over Korea. The Skyraider was produced too late for use in World War II, but became the backbone of United States Navy aircraft carrier and United States Marine Corps strike aircraft sorties in the Korean War, with the first ADs going into action from Valley Forge with VA-55 on July 3, 1950. The low-wing monoplane design started with a Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone radial engine, which was later upgraded several times. The aircraft had distinctive large straight wings with 7 hardpoints apiece. The Skyraider had excellent maneuverability at low speed and carried a large amount of ordnance over a considerable combat radius. It had a long loiter time for its size compared to much heavier subsonic or supersonic jets. During the Korean War, AD Skyraiders were flown by only the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps and were normally painted in dark navy blue. It was called the Blue Plane by enemy troops. Marine Corps Skyraiders suffered heavy losses when used in low-level close support missions. Most of those were due to the tremendous power of the AD. ADs that were waved off during carrier recovery operations were prone to performing a fatal torque roll into the sea or the deck of the aircraft carrier if the pilot mistakenly gave the AD too much throttle. The torque of the engine was so great that it would cause the aircraft to rotate about the propeller and slam into the sea or the carrier. The U.S. Navy adopted the A-1 in Vietnam because its road-ably low speed, long endurance, improved ruggedness made it ideal for low-level helicopter escort and ground fire suppression duties. The Navy AD series was initially painted in ANA 623 glossy sea blue, but during the 1950s, following the Korean War, the color scheme was changed to light gull gray and white. Initially using the gray and white Navy scheme, by 1967 the USAF began to paint its Skyraiders in a camouflaged pattern, using 2 shades of green and 1 of tan. The U.S. Navy adopted the A-1 in Vietnam because its maneuverability at low speed, long endurance, improved ruggedness made it ideal for low-level helicopter escort and ground fire suppression duties. It probably gained its greatest fame flying extremely hazardous rescue missions under the call sign Sandy. The Sandys, flying in conjunction with Jolly Green Giant rescue choppers, took on the job of locating downed air crews. Rescue helicopters were too vulnerable to operate alone, making an escort necessary. The preferred choice was a flight of A-1 Sandys. Armed with guns, bombs, and rockets, the Sandys kept enemy ground forces at bay while also providing additional support. Their mission included escorting the helicopters, conducting a general search for the downed air crew, communicating with survivors via radio, and pinpointing their exact location. Before the helicopters moved in, the A-1s also suppressed any hostile forces in the area. Even as the first Skyraiders were coming off the production line back in 1945, their piston engines had been overtaken by new turbojet technology, which promised the performance to propel aircraft through the transonic and perhaps even into the supersonic region. The problem facing the aeronautical community was that no one knew anything about the transonic flight regime. Wind tunnels had proven useless. Thus, in conjunction with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, the military services decided to build research airplanes to gather the information. The Air Force opted for a radical rocket-powered design, the Bell X-1, while the Navy took a more conservative approach and awarded Douglas a contract to build 6 jet-propelled airplanes to be designated D-558. As design of these aircraft proceeded, Ed Heinemann and his team became aware of German wartime research into swept wings and convinced of the value of employing rocket power to probe the supersonic region. Thus, 3 of the airplanes were designated D-558-2, and a parallel design effort on these aircraft got underway as work on the D-558-1 proceeded. Heinemann and his design team were treading on new ground. They'd never worked on a jet design before. Thus, once again, he opted for simplicity, wrapping a small, cigar-shaped fuselage around the 5,000-pound thrust power plant and employing conventional airfoils and flight control surfaces. After it was rolled out of the El Segundo plant in February of 1947, the Skystreak, as it was called, was trucked up to Muroc Air Force Base on California's high desert, where in April, Douglas test pilot Gene May completed its maiden flight. The Skystreak wasn't designed to set records. As he recalled later, Ed Heinemann never viewed it as anything more than a methodical way to obtain technical data. But that August, Navy test pilot Commander Turner Caldwell flew it to an official world speed record of 640 miles per hour, only to be surpassed less than a week later by Marine test pilot Major Marion Carl, who exceeded 650 miles per hour. This impressive performance was overshadowed less than 2 months later, when on October 14, 1947, the Air Force's Captain Charles E. Chuck Yeager flew the more radical rocket-powered X-1 through the sound barrier. But the Skystreak went on to more than prove its worth, flying as Heinemann had intended, an extensive research program gathering invaluable data on transonic loads and flying qualities. In the meantime, the much more exotic D-558-2 commenced its flight test program at Muroc in February 1948. Initially configured with only a small 3,000-pound thrust jet engine, the airplane was woefully underpowered and unable to exceed 600 miles per hour. While performance with a combined jet and rocket boost system improved to a top speed of 720 miles per hour, the airplane was still far from realizing the potential which had been designed into it. That potential wouldn't begin to be unleashed until the concept of fuel-consuming ground takeoffs and the heavy hybrid propulsion system were discarded in favor of air launching a fully rocket-powered airplane. Only in this configuration did the D-558-2 truly become a sky rocket. Aerodynamicists predicted that it might be capable of speeds as high as Mach 1.6, but it would far surpass their expectations. During 1951, Douglas test pilot Bill Bridgman launched away from a modified B-29 7 times and completed a remarkable series of flights, including a record top speed of Mach 1.88 and an unofficial world altitude record of more than 79,000 feet. Then, in August 1953, Marine test pilot Marion Carl extended the Skyrocket's altitude record to more than 83,000 feet. Finally, on November 20th of that year, NACA test pilot Scott Crossfield sought to coax maximum performance out of the airplane and become the first man to fly Mach 2. Following launch, he ignited the engine and pulled into a climb. Flying a very carefully defined profile with great precision, he climbed to a peak altitude of 72,000 feet and then nosed over into a dive. And at 62,000 feet, became the first man to fly at twice the speed of sound, attaining a top speed of 1,291 miles per hour, or Mach 2.005. The flight was a milestone event in the history of aviation, and a signal achievement both for the skyrocket's pilot and for the modest, self-educated engineer who had led the team which designed it. In late 1945, the U.S. Navy was searching for a new carrier-based fighter that was jet-powered and could fly in all weather. The two-seated twin-engine fighter was to be equipped with a radar and with specifications for a top speed of 500 miles per hour, an operating altitude of 40,000 feet, and able to detect an enemy 125 miles away. Led by designer Ed Heinemann, Douglas produced the designs that the U.S. Navy thought suited best and was offered a contract for 3 prototypes under the designation XF3D1 with the nickname Skyknight on March 3, 1946. The XF3D1 prototype made its first flight on March 23, 1946-1948. However, despite its status, the F3D1 did not meet all standards for aircraft carrier operations, mainly due to underpowered engines. As such, priority shifted towards the F3D-2 variant, and only 28 F3D-1 planes were produced. While the F3D-1 stayed stateside to train pilots and radar operators, the F3D-2 was sent to the Korean War in the spring of 1952. Only one F3D Skyknight was shot down during the duration of this war. After the Korean War, the F3D Skyknights became used as trainers or testing beds for the then-new air-to-air missiles, AAM, such as the AIM-7 Sparrow missiles. In 1962, the F3Ds were renamed the F-10 Skyknights, with the F3D1 and F3D2 being redesignated as F-10A and F-10B, respectively. These would later be used in Vietnam, making the Skyknights the only jet fighter to have flown in the Korean and Vietnam War. The Douglas A-20 Skyshark grew out of a post-World War II United States Navy need for a prop-driven carrier-based strike aircraft offering good operational range with comparable performance to early-generation turbojet-powered Navy types. The A-2D was essentially an offshoot of Douglas's classic A-D Skyraider of Vietnam War fame, which was already enjoying success in service since its introduction in 1946. Despite this, the A-2D was nearly an all-new, largely separate development due to the changes required to meet the new USN need. Despite its promising design, the A-2D was limited to just 12 aircraft as issues with the intended Allison engine fit were never fully resolved while progress on turbojet technology was made. The Douglas A-2D Skyshark was powered by an experimental twin-turbine engine, producing a whopping 5,000 horsepower and driving a pair of huge three-bladed counter-rotating propellers. The Skyshark demonstrated some very impressive performance. Takeoff in less than 300 feet, a 7,200 feet per minute rate of climb, more than doubling the Skyraider's performance, and a top speed 500 miles per hour. Turboprop systems, however, were far more complex than pure jets, and their development, in fact, lagged far behind. The Skyshark program was plagued from the outset by turbine and gearbox failures and a host of other engine-related problems which delayed testing and caused some serious accidents. As far as Heinemann was concerned, he was through with all manner of props. And indeed, even before the Skyshark had commenced its flight trials, another, far more exotic Heinemann prototype was undergoing final assembly. It had been conceived in response to a 1947 Navy requirement for an interceptor capable of climbing from a standing start of 40,000 feet in 5 minutes. And it reflected just how far the turbojet and Heinemann had come in the 2 short years since the design of the F3D. Turbojet technology had matured at a dramatic pace in terms of engine weight, thrust, and fuel efficiency. And Heinemann and his design staff were now able to capitalize on this, making use of all the latest aerodynamic theory and all of the work done on the Skystreak and Skyrocket to create a truly revolutionary design. Intrigued by captured German research into the high-performance advantages of tailless, delta-wing platforms, Heinemann and his team refined the concept into a modified delta and came up with a rakish XF4D Skyray. First flown at Edwards Air Force Base in January of 1951, it offered the Navy a performer which at last began to fulfill some of the promise of the turbojet revolution. Naval aviators had wanted a high-speed interceptor, and that's what Ed Heinemann gave them. In October 1953, Lieutenant Commander Jim Burton went up in one of the prototypes and, flying on the deck, punched it into afterburner as he made 4 runs over a course at the Salton Sea in the Southern California desert. This speed for the 4 passes averaged out to over 752 miles per hour, and the Skyray thereby became the first carrier-borne aircraft ever to hold the world absolute speed record. Equally impressive, less than 2 weeks later, veteran Douglas test pilot Bob Rahn flew the same aircraft on the deck over a 100-kilometer closed course at Edwards Air Force Base and claimed yet another world's record as he banked around the course at an average speed of 728 miles per hour. Affectionately known as the Ford by the pilots who flew it, the F4D was the first Navy fighter capable of Mach 1 in level flight, and as an interceptor, it far exceeded the Navy's original 5 minutes to 40,000 feet requirement, as it established 5 world time to climb records, including a climb to 40,000 feet in less than 2 minutes. The design of this airplane was a remarkable achievement, which brought Heinemann a well-earned, long overdue Collier Trophy in 1954. For many, this would have represented the pinnacle of a career, but not for Ed Heinemann. It was the largest and heaviest aircraft ever designed for routine carrier operations. Its genesis dated back to 1947, when the Navy issued specs for a long-range strategic bomber to be based on a projected new class of super carriers and capable of delivering the bulky 10,000-pound nuclear devices then in the inventory. The Navy had stipulated a maximum gross weight, including the weapon, of no more than 100,000 pounds. Ed Heinemann, however, didn't believe the supercarriers would ever be built, and thus, if the strategic bomber went into service, it'd have to operate from the much smaller, existing Midway-class carriers, which could never accommodate a 100,000-pound airplane. Thus, while industry and Navy experts continued to insist that the 100,000-pound figure was probably close to the absolute minimum for the mission, Heinemann set about to design a much smaller airplane, and when, after preliminary studies, he said he could get the job done within a gross weight 68,000 pounds, there were scoffers aplenty, and even the Navy was incredulous. His biggest problems stemmed from the heft of the 10,000-pound weapon, which required a cavernous bomb bay and had to be accessible from the cockpit so that one of the crew could arm it. Indeed, the whole logic of the design evolved from this consideration. Dictated, for example, the large, swept-back, shoulder-mounted wing, which in turn necessitated a narrow-track undercarriage retracting into the fuselage. As development proceeded, Heinemann stubbornly waged a constant battle against weight. Ed Heinemann, always weight-conscious, strove even harder to keep the aircraft weight well below the 100,000-pound limit, as he was convinced that construction of the supercarrier would be canceled as a result of the power struggle between the USAF and USN. Although doubting that Douglas could build an aircraft 2/3 the weight of its rival, the Navy gave Curtiss and Douglas a 3-month preliminary design contract to enable them to refine their proposals. Soon it became evident that indeed Ed Heinemann and his team would be able to realize their promise, and on 31st March 1949, Douglas was awarded a contract for 2 XA-3D-1s and a static test airframe. Named the Skywarrior, the airplane exceeded all expectations when it went to the fleet, establishing a host of transoceanic and transcontinental speed records. The A3D excelled in its nuclear deterrent role, and ultimately operated off carriers at gross weights of up to 84,000 pounds. Moreover, like so many Heinemann airplanes, it proved remarkably adaptable to a wide range of additional missions. Thus, in Vietnam, Skywarriors would figure prominently in such diverse roles as photo reconnaissance, mine laying, electronic countermeasures, and aerial refueling. Throughout its service, the Skywarrior was the heaviest operational aircraft to operate from an aircraft carrier, which contributed to its nickname of Whale. German work on delta wing planforms, directed by Dr. Alexander Lippisch, led to a U.S. Navy proposal in 1947 for a short-range carrier-based interceptor fighter. Project studies were initiated by the Douglas design team, led by Ed Heinemann, with the object of producing a fighter optimized for a high rate of climb and capable of intercepting enemy aircraft. Heinemann initiated a study and found that for every pound of equipment or structure added to an airplane's original design, it had to grow an additional 10 pounds in order to maintain its original performance, speed, and range. The principal cause of this growth factor was, in his words, tack hammer engineering. Tacking on unnecessary additional systems, structure, and gadgetry, which, he explained, could be avoided with a little forethought. The cure, he said, was more diligent engineering, painstaking analysis of every single structural and system component in order to refine and simplify them to the maximum degree of efficiency. When the Navy asked if he could actually apply this philosophy to the design of a new jet attack bomber in 1952, he jumped at the chance. The spec called for a top speed of 580 miles per hour, an unrefueled combat radius of 400 miles, a 2,000-pound weapon load, and a max gross weight of less than 30,000 pounds. Confident he could exceed all of the performance goals while reducing the gross weight by more than half, he finalized his concept, and working with longtime El Segundo engineer and artist R.G. Smith, started roughing out a configuration design. And after considering a variety of shapes, structures, and entire configurations, the distinctive lines of the A4D Skyhawk emerged from their efforts. While the configuration underwent extensive refinement, Heinemann laid down the law to every member of his design team. Eliminate the unessential and cut the weight of each component to the minimum without jeopardizing its integrity. Such an approach resulted in a single wing box structure, for example, which was only 27 feet in span, thus wouldn't require the weight and complexity of a folding mechanism, and which would serve as a single, leak-proof integral fuel tank. By challenging every pound in the airplane, he proved that careful attention to detail spawned remarkable ingenuity. The short-span delta wing did not require the complexity of wingtip folding, saving an estimated 200 pounds. Its spars were machined from a single forging that spanned across both wingtips. The leading edge slats were designed to drop automatically at the appropriate speed by gravity and air pressure, saving weight and space by omitting actuation motors and switches. Similarly, the main undercarriage did not penetrate the main wing spar, designed so that when retracted only the wheel itself was inside the wing, and the undercarriage struts were housed in a fairing below the wing. Thus, the wing structure was lighter with the same overall strength. The Skyhawk proved to be a relatively common United States Navy aircraft export. Due to its small size, it could be operated from older, smaller World War II-era aircraft carriers still used by smaller navies during the 1960s. These older ships were often unable to accommodate newer Navy fighters such as the F4 Phantom II and F8 Crusader, which were faster and more capable than the A4, but significantly larger and heavier. The aircraft's 5 hardpoints support a variety of missiles, bombs, and other munitions. It was capable of carrying a bomb load equivalent to that of a World War II-era Boeing B-17 bomber, and could deliver nuclear weapons using a low-altitude bombing system and a loft delivery technique. The Douglas A-4 Skyhawk played a significant role in both South and North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, serving primarily with the United States Navy, Marine Corps, and the South Vietnamese Air Force. In South Vietnam, the A-4 was heavily involved in close air support for ground troops, counterinsurgency operations, and interdiction missions against Viet Cong supply lines. Operating from aircraft carriers and land bases, the Skyhawk provided quick response air support to U.S. and South Vietnamese forces, often attacking enemy positions, bunkers, and supply routes. The A-4 was a key U.S. Navy strike aircraft against North Vietnamese targets throughout the war. It was frequently used in Operation Rolling Thunder, 1965 to 1968, where it bombed strategic targets, including bridges, supply depots, airfields, and transportation routes. The Skyhawk's high-speed, low-altitude attack profile made it a preferred platform for delivering precision strikes, but it also made the aircraft vulnerable to North Vietnamese air defenses. The Douglas A-4 Skyhawk proved to be one of the most versatile and enduring attack aircraft of its time. From the jungles of Vietnam, where it provided close air support and struck strategic targets in the north, to the decks of U.S. Navy aircraft carriers, the Skyhawk demonstrated its rugged reliability and combat effectiveness. Though it faced increasing threats from enemy defenses, the A-4 remained a critical asset throughout the conflict, shaping aerial warfare tactics for years to come. Beyond the battlefield, the Skyhawk found a lasting legacy in training and precision flying. Even after its combat service ended, it remained a vital part of military aviation, with some nations keeping it in operation for decades. Perhaps one of its most iconic roles came with the U.S. Navy Blue Angels, who flew the A-4 from 1974 to 1986. In their hands, the Skyhawk became a symbol of speed, agility, and precision, inspiring countless aviation enthusiasts and demonstrating the aircraft's lasting impact. Though retired from frontline service, the A-4 Skyhawk will always be remembered as a combat-proven, pilot-loved aircraft, one that left its mark in history both in war and in the skies of airshows around the world.
The Skyraider evolved into one of the most versatile aircraft ever developed by the US military. The post-World War II design saw service in several variations in both Korea and Vietnam. The Skyraider's ability to carry a wide assortment of weapons made it a devastating ground attack aircraft. Some planes have short lifetimes, generally because they reflect the needs of their era. A very few remain in service for so long that they seem permanent. This plane stayed around long enough to be 3 planes. It was initially the BT-2D, and then it was the AD, and then it was the A-1. It was such a success that the only major criticism leveled at it was that not enough were built. The first Douglas Skyraider, known as the Destroyer II, took off in March 1945, beginning a service career that was to stretch unbroken to Vietnam. After the last US Navy A-1 combat missions were flown, the plane was still being used ashore by the United States and South Vietnamese Air Forces. Where or when the last Skyraider in combat service flew a mission is somewhat of a mystery. It's probable that they were used in the African state of Chad as recently as 1979. Even as the Skyraider was in development, it was already widely believed to be obsolete. After all, it was designed and constructed at the same time as the development of the jet engine aircraft in an era that was so obsessed with speed. While other designs were scratching at their heads about the best way to get around the sound barrier, Douglas engineers were wrestling old-fashioned problems with propellers and radial engines. Nobody questioned that the design was a pinnacle of piston-powered aviation, but many questioned the need for climbing that pinnacle. In hindsight, it can be seen that the Skyraider was the sum of an enormous bank of knowledge built up over time. In 1925, just 20 years before the first flight of the Skyraider, the US Navy had 1 aircraft carrier. By 1935, this figure had only increased to 4. There was no debate about the use and worth of these big ships, but the navies of the world still assessed each other's strength in the number and caliber of battleship guns deployed. Through the 20s and 30s, the number of ships and planes slowly increased. Experimentation and testing went a long way towards sorting out the systems, methods, and value of naval aviation. The increasing sophistication and expertise of the crews soon demonstrated telling points in the debate about the function and worth of carriers. It became evident to many that the future of naval conflict would be dominated by air power. Pearl Harbor not only settled all arguments from the die-hard battleship supporters. In the Pacific, it also settled the matter in a practical way. For the moment, the only American force of real power capable of action was the carriers. At the outbreak of war, the carriers' complements were, as usual, in transition. It was a major turning point in aviation, with monoplanes taking over from the trusty biplanes. As war stretched, the planes in use were quickly shown to have major flaws. War demanded different specifications. Fortunately, the conflict in Europe gave a short but significant lead time to aircraft designers, and production was already underway on new, more effective planes. Curtiss Helldivers and Grumman Avengers were to carry the bulk of the weight of war for the U.S. ships. These followed the established pattern of 2-seat dive bombers and 3-seat torpedo bombers. The Helldiver, ordered in 1939 and first flown in 1940, became the standard Navy dive bomber of the last 2 years of the war. But throughout its career, it was troublesome and displayed several flaws. Among these were instability, an operation range of only 250 miles, and poor maintenance access. The plane had not lived up to expectation as a load carrier, or for its short takeoff ability. But the Helldivers were the best planes available for the job, and they were used to good effect. On the other hand, the Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers were a great success. The planes they were to replace, the aging Douglas Devastators, were so outdated that the Avengers were ordered to full production even before the prototype flew. The gamble paid off. With a 2,000-pound bomb or torpedo load, the Avengers, when they went into service, were invaluable, and they were to stay with the fleet until 1954. Another message was also loud and clear. The layout of attack and bomber aircraft had become outdated. The speed and firepower of fighters was such that there was no way for bombers to protect themselves. Their gunners were no deterrent to fighter attack. They needed to depend on their own fighter escorts for control of the sky. This meant there was no real point in the wasted weight of revolving gun turrets. The load would be better carried out as fuel and bombs. Naval aviation was clearly one of the most powerful weapons at America's disposal, and plans were developing to meet their needs far beyond the war's end. New, reliable, and powerful engines were available. Experience made it possible to predict accurately the behavior of a design shape. Combat indicated that the gunner was a redundant concept, and, in the same way, the observer or bombardier was wasted in a specialized airframe. The next specification for Navy attack plane to be issued was for a single-seat aircraft. Douglas had been working on their submission, the BTD-1, from 1942. But it was clear that the plane, essentially a pre-war design, was no match for its competitors, including the formidable Martin AM-1. While war went on, the situation came to a head on the 16th of June 1944 at a meeting between the heads of Douglas team and Navy representatives. The chief designer of the Douglas Navy plant, Ed Heinemann, asked for permission to cancel the plane and use funds on a new aircraft. In their hotel, overnight, he and two assistants, working on the basis of the knowledge they had gained in the years since the designing of the BTD, came up with the outlines for a new plane. The sketches he presented the next morning, accompanied by their technical explanation, intrigued and impressed the Navy's representatives. Douglas was, in effect, allowed to re-enter the competition. They had only 9 months to get their plane into the air, and it had to comply with very tight and unforgiving specifications. It was, in fact, 9 months and 1 day late to its first flight. About an hour after takeoff, the test pilot was back on the ground, enthusiastic about the plane. It had exceeded his expectation, as it was to exceed the expectations of many people during its lifetime. But the war was drawing to a conclusion. Douglas, having produced the goods, faced the risk of the market disappearing. Wartime contracts for 548 planes were cancelled. 3 were delivered in 1945, and only another 22 in 1946. This minimal production saved the Skyraider. Though the future of a piston-engine aircraft seemed questionable, this plane was clearly something to be reckoned with. And in 1947, the Navy purchased 239 in 3 different versions. In time, the plane would operate in many other roles: ambulance, ECM platform, RPV or drone director, target tow, anti-submarine warfare aircraft, night fighter plane, rescue helicopter escort, early warning radar platform, and even as a transport seating 12 passengers. In all, there were to be around 30 major types, and about the same number of subtypes. The Skyraider never ran out of uses.
The 82 was a very stable aircraft. It was not difficult to fly. In fact, to check out, going from one plane to another, going from training command, where I flew Corsairs, to the A2, really read the handbook and took open book tests and sat in the cockpit and learned the location of everything. Then it was time to go. Very quick and a lot of fun. The 82 was a good plane to land on a carrier. I went on one full cruise of 6 months and never got a wave off. And I was not the exception. It was just a neat plane on the carrier. I was a young pilot. I even took off with the flaps up. A mistake. Still got airborne. It was just fine.
Korea saw Skyraiders thrown into conflict, where they played a major part in that war. Korea brought the world's remaining ideological camps into conflict. Remnants of the 1930s school of dictators would be swept into the skirts of one camp or the other for the next 40 years. And history would come to see the Cold War as a continuation of the Second World War. On the ground, there were times when battles resembled World War I, with the new American technologies of war fitted against infantry armed with rifles and trenches. The helicopter became a major weapon. United Nations air domination was, for most of the war, complete. The services of Korea's giant neighbor, China, effectively replaced North Korean forces because these had been destroyed. China was still coy about what it cost to maintain the line near the 38th parallel. But that line would hold, and the war would be settled with penance. The aerial war was shared between generations. Jets were deployed, but their need for long, straight runways hampered their effectiveness, especially in the frantic early days of the war, as the North Koreans swept the peninsula and captured all but the tiny pocket around Busan. The Air Force was hampered by having to fly from Japan with relatively short-range jets. The Navy's carriers were called on for a high proportion of support for the soldiers fighting on desperately. Skyraiders are essentially a big fighter plane. They don't have an internal bomb bay. This was not included for 2 reasons. 1, additional weight in hydraulics and hinges for the doors, and 2, it restricted the nature of the load. It was reasoned that strengthened wings with multiple mounts would accommodate a greater range of stores packages. In fact, the Skyraiders would carry at one time or another the whole inventory, including weapons that were rumors or theories in 1944, when the plane was first drawn up. During the Korean War, Skyraiders took part in highly secret experiments, carrying nuclear weapons, and later, in 1953, the AD-4D variant would be developed specifically for that purpose, but it would never be called on to deliver these weapons. It would make and polish its enduring reputation with a range of conventional stores. In the desperate days early in the Korean War, and later as the fighting dragged on, the Skyraiders were increasingly accepted as being the Navy's big punch. Their varied loads were delivered precisely and effectively, and could include rockets and napalm, and a range of small and large bombs to suit particular targets. Their loads had one other outstanding feature. They were enormous. On several occasions, a Skyraider would deliver a weight of bombs that was greater than its own weight. Loads of up to 14,000 pounds were carried in a plane that weighed only 11,000 pounds. This was well outside the parameters of what could be expected from most other aircraft in service. And the longer the war went on, the more additional orders flowed into the Douglas factory. The orders had in fact been stockpiling due to delays in delivery. There was a series of problems with the new engine. There had also been problems with the introduction of the plane into service. The design team had expended a great deal of energy on minimizing weight. This led to some modifications to cure stress problems which had developed in the initial carrier trials of the plane. These problems were partly the result of a poor landing technique. In response, the pilots were given additional practice, while the Skyraider was also strengthened to withstand heavier impacts. Most of the planes they served with in Korea were to be phased out rapidly. The jets because of the rapid developments in technology, and the piston planes because of their age. The Skyraider's future was already being scrutinized in order to develop specifications for a replacement aircraft. The conclusion was a tribute to the big Douglas aircraft, because the Navy decided to buy 3 aircraft, splitting the roles performed by the Skyraider to a range of airframes. In 1949, the future of the ADs could at best have been described as uncertain. Very few could have predicted they would endure long into the jet era, but orders continued. And when production eventually ceased on the 18th of February 1957, 3,180 Skyraiders had been built. It would be many more years before they would be found in museums.
When we would get back to Japan on rest and recreation, if we ever met Army people or Marines that had been on the ground up in the front lines and told them what we flew, they always said, well, you guys are the ones that saved our lives and we wouldn't have your job for anything.
Oftentimes we'd find, particularly a Vietnamese pilot who was rather short, that we'd have to put a seat cushion or a pillow behind them so we could move the Vietnamese pilot forward so that he could get full right rudder, particularly with a heavy load on a short runway where it needed full power instantly.
In September 1960, the first Skyraiders arrived in a new theater of conflict, in a new role as a fighter to join the Vietnamese Air Force. In May, a further 25 arrived, where they became a major factor in the air war over Vietnam. United States involvement with the Vietnamese Air Force grew, not only in supplying aircraft, but helping in many ways to tune the Vietnamese into a combat-ready force. In 1962, pilot training was transferred to the United States. Coincidentally, military aviation experimentation was being directed toward the question, what type of aircraft would best answer the tactical requirements in counterinsurgency operations. The answer was an aircraft with the attributes of the Douglas Skyraider. U.S. involvement with the Vietnamese Air Force had formally started in 1955, but it was not until the early 60s that U.S. advisors were sent to Vietnam in noticeable numbers. American pilots supplemented the locals. American administrators, ground crew, and trainers also multiplied, and the flow of aircraft continued. Also increasing through this time was the level of insurgent activity. The Saigon regime, riddled with corruption and badly out of touch with the population, was tottering along under Dien. The country was a breeding ground for civil discontent. Leaflet drops and aerial propaganda broadcasting were no answer to the situation. The flow of arms and then troops from the north made the situation in much of the south untenable. For military efforts to work, the nature of the regime would have to change, giving some recognition to the interests of the people. Sadly, Southern politics would be limited to a series of presidents. The system persisted. The only movement was a gradual decay that eventually became defeat. When they received their first Skyraiders, the Vietnamese were disappointed. They had been expecting jets. However, the Geneva Agreement outlawed the introduction of such advanced weapons into the conflict. The Vietnamese Air Force would not get its first jets, Northrop F-5s, until 1967. In the interim, they used a variety of aircraft in well-organized and effective operations against the guerrilla forces. Spotters and attack aircraft worked together closely to provide a powerful and precise support to the ground operations. After the close and often hands-on guidance of the U.S. Air Force advisors, the VNAF developed tactical responses to guerrilla operations that were to remain models for much of the war. Smoke markers fired by Cessna bird dogs operating as forward air controllers would indicate targets for the Skyraiders. In 1962, the name of the Skyraider changed again, with the revision of the Navy nomenclature to the A-1. The Skyraider's third official designation actually suited the plane perfectly. A-1 was certainly an accurate description. Over the skies in Vietnam, Skyraiders performed an outstanding role in counterinsurgency, and another customer, the United States Air Force, was soon to be flying them alongside the Vietnamese.
My fellow Americans, as President and Commander-in-Chief, it is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf.
President Johnson's announcement after the Gulf of Tonkin incident was not actually the first American involvement in the Vietnam conflict. President Kennedy had promoted counterinsurgency as essential, and Air Force units had grown up around this specialty. Nor had they taken long to arrive in Vietnam with its long-running guerrilla war. Now they were joined by the full weight of the military. The lessons they had learned were passed on to operations on a far grander scale. With the formal commitment of the United States forces came a transformation of the conflict. The entire conventional weight of the U.S. was committed in a guerrilla war. Helicopters would be the enduring image of Vietnam, as gunships, as troop carriers, and as a rescue for downed pilots.
Airborne at flight of 16, event 101-4, over.
Bravo 8-1, this is Clearwater. Roger. Your pigeons to Point Cairo, 28014. Over.
The increasing weight of war machinery and the new methods of employing it developed along with a bewildering series of political skirmishes. Together, these military and political developments gave new meaning to the expression, the futility of war. U.S. Air Force Skyraiders had started Vietnam operations in May 1964 with Vietnamese observers who were nominally in charge of activity. The twin-seat A-1Es they used were to be the first of many U.S. Air Force Skyraiders to serve in the theater. By the time the E's began to run out, the U.S. was fully involved. They could be replaced with the still numerous single-seaters. The use of these planes, alongside Mach 2 jets, was not incongruous. It was a result of specialization. Skyraiders had exceptional attributes. The ground troops appreciated their heavy load of ordnance and the fact that they could loiter, waiting for work. Their pilots loved the accuracy that could be achieved when flying something as stable, slow, and maneuverable as their A1s. They were also grateful for the armored toughness of the planes, which could absorb tremendous battle damage. In their long career, the Skyraiders earned several nicknames. There was a drive to have them known as the Pulverizer, which never took. They were known after their call sign in Korea as ADs, which were able dogs. They also had other names. They were Spads, and in their rescue work, they were Sandy. Their activity and close support was unmatchable. They pounded away with an accuracy impossible with supersonic aircraft. They provided this service in virtually all weather. When the jets were grounded, the Skyraiders were out there working. Admittedly, they offered a pretty good target. Someone who had been trying to hit a Mach 2 jet would have welcomed the sight of a Spad to shoot at. But the Spads soaked up the damage and kept going, at least to the extent of getting home, even if they wouldn't fly again. The US Air Force lost 153 Skyraiders in combat in Vietnam between 1962 and 1973. A further 41 were listed as operational losses. Considering the job they did, this is a testament to the aircraft. 146 of the US Air Force losses were caused by ground fire. Only 3 were lost to SAMs, 2 to MiGs, and 2 in attacks on airfields. This reflects the way they were used. In close support, wherever the troops happened to be on that day, or as escorts for rescue helicopters. Incredibly dangerous roles, day after day. Whereas the overall US average of losses due to ground fire was 57%, for the Skyraiders, that figure was 75%. The twin-seat A-1E models that the Air Force had taken out of Navy mothballs simply wore out. There comes a time in life of an aircraft when the next rebuild cannot be justified, and the E models had come to that point. The US Air Force would continue to use Skyraiders, replacing the aging E's with the single-seat H model. The last E model flew its final mission on the 10th of April 1967, and was hoisted aboard ship for its journey back to the USA. There was quite a bit of history in that moment. The nickname Spad referred to a First World War biplane. At first, it expressed the scorn of the jet pilots for the lumbering old warhorses that cluttered their airfields. However, the Spads in Vietnam changed that scorn into grudging respect, and then into awe. In time, many of the jet jockeys would owe a great deal to the Spads, because Vietnam had given the Skyraiders a new task. Many knowledgeable people maintain that the Spads found their finest hour in this new role: rescue helicopter aircraft. The rescue parties involved a variety of aircraft: control aircraft, spotters, the rescue choppers, and the pugnacious A-1s as escorts. The control aircraft would patrol at height, listening for the radio beacon of a downed pilot. After establishing the pilot's whereabouts, a rescue team would be directed to the area. Strike aircraft would also be involved in covering the operation, especially when the rescue was conducted deep inside North Vietnam. The work of these crews in the helicopter and other aircraft required great courage. Despite the danger, the units pressed each mission as hard as possible, and in the course of the war were credited with an amazing 3,833 rescues.
Rooster Lead, this is Crown 1. We've verified your identity. Fannies are en route. We'll arrive in your area in 8 minutes. Jolly Greens in 19 minutes. We have a bald MIG-cap for you. It should be in your area by now.
Roger, I have tally-ho the MIG-cap. Thank you.
Stay in orbit over Red Rooster 2 until Sandy's arrived.
Roger, Crown.
Roger, Crown. This is Sandy 1. Go ahead.
Red Rooster Lead is still orbiting over Down Pilot at coordinates 1020 north, 10550 east. He has reported enemy automatic weapon fire 1 mile north of Down Pilot. There may be a lot more around the pilot himself. Sandy 1, this is Crown. I am designating you on-scene commander. Take over.
Roger, Crown. I've got it.
Skyraiders filled the role of escort well. They had the endurance to stay aloft for hours. They could quite happily hover along with the slow helicopters. At the location of a rescue, they could bring their firepower into play to suppress any hostile activity in the area, allowing the Jolly Greens to go about their business with little interference. For these missions, the Skyraiders were fully loaded with ordnance and ammunition. Because of the vulnerability of helicopters to ground fire, it was essential that enemy activity be suppressed before the choppers presented themselves as stationary targets hovering above the downed crew. As a result, the A-1s would engage in what was referred to as trolling for fire. This consisted of flying low and deliberately drawing fire from enemy guns near the scene. When these guns had been located and silenced, the air would be safer for helicopters. It did, however, make a Skyraider a dangerous place to be. The rescue team's motto was that others may live. To that end, they were prepared to risk their lives. The parajumpers, the men who went down the wire to the pilot, were trained scuba divers in case the rescue took place over the water. They were qualified parachutists and experts with small arms and hand-to-hand combat. They were also fully trained in first aid. With the rest of the crew, they faced the danger of flying low and slow in their chopper to the rescue site, often under intense fire. Then, they left even the aircraft's limited safety to become dangling targets that others may live.
And the beautiful thing about the A-1 is that it could stay over the guy for hours on time. It had a versatile load. With 15 external stations, you could put a wide variety of ordnance on the aircraft. So it meant that when you got airborne, you could be applied to a wide variety of targets and situations. The disadvantage to the A-1 is obvious, because while it was an airplane with tremendous staying power and time in the air, it was very slow. And as a result, it was a fairly easy target for less sophisticated automatic weapons and anti-air.
The Navy had apparently replaced the Skyraider when it split the roles of the plane among 3 airframes. The Grumman tracker was to take over anti-submarine missions and went into service in 1954. The 1952 Douglas Skywarrior was to carry out long-range bombing, including nuclear bombing. And the Douglas Skyhawk, the superb A-4, was to do everything else. But no one had told the Skyraiders. They were still there in 1964 when the carriers found themselves in Vietnam, still a standard medium attack plane. Certainly, the other types were there as well. But mingling with the screaming jets of the Phantoms, Skyhawks, and Vigilantes was the throbbing piston engine roar of the Skyraiders. They were an important part of the striking power of the carriers in the early years of Navy involvement, and their slow and accurate attacks brought huge bomb loads to targets with deadly effect. In contrast to their jet-powered comrades, they were likely to be found on their way back to the ship, quietly looking for targets of opportunity. Their accuracy, huge loads, and long range made them uniquely valuable. But all good things must come to an end. If the production lines were not to be reopened for further construction, there was only the existing Skyraiders. They were getting old, not just because of their date of manufacturing, but because they were being worked so hard. What happens to a plane in combat is extraordinary, and the Skyraiders were in the process of being replaced by a fourth aircraft, the Grumman A-6 Intruder. Although some were taken out of mothballs to be revitalized by the US Air Force, the A-1s were being phased out of service, this time for real. On Sunday, the 20th of February, 1968, Lieutenant Theodore Hill landed his Skyraider on the USS Coral Sea after completing a combat mission over Vietnam. He was 23 years old, and the Skyraider had been in service for 23 years. He had just completed the last combat mission of US Navy Skyraiders. That was it. The old planes had finished their Navy service. No amount of polishing could extend their lifespan. They could still have been loaded with arms and sent on more missions, but it was time to call it a day. After a career as a full-time anachronism, the Skyraider had finally earned a long overdue retirement. Their replacements were already in service. Indeed, some of their replacements were due for replacements themselves. Pilots had a love affair with their A-1s. They were disappointed that they had to give up the SPADs. This was no reflection on their new planes. But there was simply no replacement for the seat-of-your-pants climb, the ponderous but dynamic control, the stability, the leisure, the intensity of action, the accuracy and power of the Skyraiders. They flew such long missions that the pilots often took their lunch with them. Substitutions were made for the Skyraiders. There was never a real replacement.
They've been called controlled collisions. Approaching at speeds of more than 140 miles per hour and sync rates of over 20 feet per second, naval combat aircraft must repeatedly slam on the carrier decks and be hauled within seconds to an abrupt stop. They have to be rugged to withstand this type of punishment. The structural strength translates into added weight, which cuts down on performance, range, and load-carrying capability. How rugged is rugged enough? But what about carrier launches? A catapult, mechanical slingshot, can hurl an airplane from 0 to 140 miles per hour within 2.5 seconds. How do you ensure smooth, fully controllable flight as the airplane quickly transitions from wheels and flaps down to a clean configuration, and the aerodynamic forces change in volume and intensity at an incredible rate? Though unique to naval operations, these are only a couple of the myriad of questions that aircraft designers must consider as they attempt to hone their craft into something better, more effective than anything which has preceded it. An incredibly complex array of factors come into play as they attempt to overcome problems impacting airspeed, maneuverability, range, weapons delivery, systems integration, maintainability, and, the bottom line, cost and schedule. All of these and a host of other questions must be answered to the designer's satisfaction before he can answer that most important question of all. Will his design meet the requirements? Will it get the job done? This man answered those questions